really going to talk more about what we at TechTarget have learned from a lot of your peers. Because one of the great things about working at TechTarget is we get to work with so many of you, so many other customers, literally thousands of active customers, and we get to observe their best practices as they take on opportunities and challenges. So we're going to talk a little bit about tech marketer challenges today. We're absolutely going to touch on how data can help with that. But really, it is tactical, as John said. It's a lot of things that we see all of you and your peers employing to address some of the challenges that you face today. So we're going to focus on three areas that tech marketers tell us they're focused on. That's marketing automation and scoring, it's account-based marketing, and it's intent, data, and predictive analytics. So marketers out there may not be doing all three of these things, but most are looking at being in some phase or another with respect to these. They either have implemented or are looking to implement. They are evaluating and looking to do this out in the not too distant future, or they're trying to optimize what they've already got in place. And in each of these areas, we'll talk a little bit about the challenges and opportunities that the marketers are up against, how they're responding to that, and a little bit on how TechTarget can help. And of course, as John pointed out, a big part of that is data that will help you assess who's really in market for your solutions. So let's kick off with marketing automation and scoring. And this is the more mature of these three technologies. And we all got involved in this because we all generated a lot of leads. And once we generated a lot of leads, we needed to know which were the good ones, right? The problem with this is it's a lot of work and it's not magic. Nurture streams need to be conceived. There's a lot of logic, if-then logic that goes into that. You need the content to support that. And despite all the effort we put into this, these systems are still not necessarily graduating the best leads to sales as MQLs and SQLs. So let's take a little bit of a deep dive into what's going on there. So, and Paul touched on this, one of the factors is that most of our scoring models today still don't yet factor in account level insights, and that's a big part of the lesson that Paul was delivering, that you need to start to factor in account level insights in order to understand who's really in market. And even people that are doing predictive analytics and purchase intent, and they're looking at that in their sales and marketing efforts, they haven't yet worked that stuff into their scoring models. The problem that introduces is this notion of false negatives and false positives. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through this slide. And also, we'll touch on this throughout the presentation today because it's kind of a key concept, at least with respect to the message that we're delivering here today. So, what's going on with scoring? Well, one of the biggest things we see, and this is almost a new thing nowadays, is that our engagement-based scoring models aren't necessarily graduating enough leads to sales, to MQL and SQL states. And what's going on here is a couple of things. First of all, people, when they do their purchase research, when they consume content nowadays, do binge content consumption. Once you're in research mode, you're out there, you're collecting as much of this content as you possibly can. That's the nature of things nowadays, at least back in the States. Everybody uses Netflix to binge all their favorite shows. This is the natural order of things nowadays. And what's happening is in our 6 to 8 week multi-touch nurture streams, you're not getting enough touches to score those leads out of or into, depending on your parlance, MQLs and SQLs for sales. So that's a big factor. The other thing that's going on is a lot of scoring models are at least partly based on profile data. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. This could be things like firmographics or demographics. You want to go after big companies or you want to go after good titles. There's two problems here. One is if your weighting is in your scoring is too heavily towards that information, or if those profile factors are too aspirational. In other words, we want to go after just big companies. We want to just sell to the office of the CIO. If that's factored in your scoring model, sometimes that can introduce the concept of leads that look good but aren't necessarily productive for your sales force. So in terms of false positives and false negatives, when you've got these prospects who don't progress through your nurture screen, they don't score in as leads, that's a false negative. That's somebody who's actually a lead, who's actually in market. We don't see that. When we nominate somebody who, based on their profile, looks like somebody we'd like to sell to, we aspire to sell to, but they're not really in market, that's a false positive. And we'll talk again a little bit more about that concept as we move forward. So what's happening? Sales is dissatisfied a lot of times because the proper expectations haven't been set about what's going on with lead scoring. So they need to understand that this is going to have an impact on the number of the leads they see and the quality of the leads they get so that they can behave differently. And in terms of behaving differently, a lot of times we haven't set effective SLAs. SLAs is something Paul touched on as well, for appropriate sales follow-up for more qualified leads. And if you think about it, you're passing along a lead which is supposed to be more qualified. The lead disposition methodology ought to be a little bit different. So let's talk a little bit more about this concept of false positives and false negatives, because when we get to data, that's a big part of what you're trying to do with data is eliminate these scenarios. From the perspective of lead generation, what we're considering to be true, or our definition of true, is that it's a lead, a prospect, or an account that's in market. False is somebody we think is not in market for what we're doing. So if you think they're not in market and it turns out in reality that they're not in market, that's a correct no. If you think they are in market and it turns out to be the case that that's really a good lead for you, then that's true. Now, if you think that they're not in market, but they actually are, and we've missed that signal from part of the active demand that's out there in the space, that's a false negative, right? And so now you're not getting your fair share of the active demand in the marketplace for your solution. If we think that this is a lead for us, if we score it high and it turns out not to be, that's a false positive. Now, false negatives may sound worse, and probably they are. Missing out on the demand when you're a marketer is a big deal, but false positives are a big deal too, because when we say this is a lead that's worthy of follow-up, we're going to spend time on it, we're going to spend resources, and if it turns out not to be a good lead, you're going to hurt your credibility with sales. So our goal in marketing is to avoid both the false positives and the false negatives. The next concept I want to touch upon a little bit, because it factors throughout everything we're going to talk about today, is this role of the BDR or the telemarketer, the SDR, the lead development rep, whatever you call them, in effective follow-up on your leads, right? Because a lot of times when we conceive our marketing campaigns and we're thinking of who we're trying to service, we've got that end field salesperson in mind. But the reality is, in 80% of the cases, at least with our customers, those leads have got to work their way through a telemarketing process first before they ever get to field sales. So how these people treat these leads and how they think of them is a really big deal. So what leads do your BDRs and SDRs think are the best leads? Probably no one's going to shout out the answer. I'll tell you, in our experience, what our customers see, it's the fresh ones. It's the ones they got today, right? I'm going to call the new list, I'm going to call the good leads. So the question is, what happens to those great leads, those highly qualified leads that you passed along a week ago or yesterday because they're no longer in the queue to be called by those SDRs? How do they know which leads are good? Well, a lot of times they think it's the ones that take my call, or they call me back, or they're willing to take a meeting, right? Now that's true. If they do that, that's productive. That's a productive lead. You can do something with it. The problem is on the other side of that equation, which is what happens if they don't call back, if they don't take the call. Well, from the BDR's perspective, that's a bad lead. And the problem is, when we had our little chart about what we believe and what's reality, that has nothing to do with reality. That could be the hottest lead you've handed off in the last 3 weeks, but as far as they're concerned, if they didn't engage, it's not a good lead. So they're a disqualification element in your process, and you don't really think of them that way. That's not what you think of their role. In terms of their role, generally what these people are trying to do is one of these three things. This is the case with marketing, too, with respect to leads. They're either trying to identify a prospect, they're going to try to qualify a prospect, or they're trying to engage, right? There's a emphasis in that will vary depending on the lead score, the campaign, and so forth. But an important thing to think about is if you're already passing along leads, which you've identified, and have deemed to some extent to be qualified, you need to have these folks shifting their emphasis to a greater degree towards engagement. It's their job not to figure out whether or not that customer calls them back and therefore is a bad or good lead. It's their job to get that customer on the phone. It's their job to do something to make that prospect potentially engage with you. So what are some of the things we see going on to address this in terms of best practices? Well, coming back to this notion of false negatives, because these are leads that never score into an MQL or SQL state, what we see our customers doing is implementing simpler and more compressed nurture streams. They're backing away from 6 to 8 week multi-touch nurture streams, and they're putting together what are essentially modules of the best content for two or three or four scenarios. So think of it like this. It's a couple of pieces of your most engaging content. It's a couple of pieces of late-stage content, so you can potentially qualify them for late-stage interest. And then it's generally 2 or 3 pieces of content that relate to the reason the person ended up being a lead for you in the first place. So maybe they came in for the security angle on your solution, so you make sure that you follow up with additional security content. So now you're using some of your best content across multiple streams or modules to more effectively engage, and you're doing it in a much more compressed fashion. We're seeing people try to get 2 emails out a week over the course of 2 to 3 weeks' time, sometimes 3 a week, over 2 weeks' time, so that you can better align with that client when they're in that content consumption binge mode of trying to research your solutions and how they can potentially solve their problems. The other thing we see going on is people are moving to content formats that enable that sort of binge consumption experience, right? So think in terms of a microsite. You take centerpiece content, you surround that with other content items, maybe video that you can engage with, maybe a podcast, maybe links to other white paper assets. Well, what we're seeing is people trying to encourage that type of content consumption with respect to their outbound lead assets. So filling your PDFs with lots of links to other assets, maybe having interactive HTML formats that they can tap into. There are companies out there that help enable this sort of thing in your outbound marketing. One is called Lookbook HQ. There's another one called Uberflip. And what these folks do is they take that sort of microsite experience and they bring it right to the asset that you're promoting in your email outbound and nurture stream. The other thing is we see people moving to new scoring models. Paul already talked about starting to factor in account level signals, but also we're seeing things like scoring off of stakeholder interest. We're seeing a team-wide engagement as a factor. And if you're using the sort of media formats that can allow you to assess things like time spent or intensity of the interaction with the content, we're seeing that as a factor too. So you're not always going to get your 4 and 5 touch score in, so you want to look for other factors that you can use to help with that. Setting sales SLAs for more productive follow-up over what's going to be a more limited number of more qualified leads, our customers find to be a critical thing to do. And we talk to people all the time who said, I'm doing nurturing, how long have you been doing it? I've been doing it for a couple of years. What SLAs have you set with sales? And they said, you know what, we haven't really even talked to sales about what's different about the leads that we're passing along now. What we see is people with these new SLAs starting to employ new disposition models. So instead of activity metrics, we're seeing folks focus on productivity metrics. So as opposed to I'm going to touch each lead 5 times, or I'm going to call as many leads as I can that are in my inbox today, we're seeing things like, okay, you've gotten 300 leads, your job is to set 30 appointments in the next 2 weeks. So the issue is penetration, not activity. We're seeing edicts set like, hey, you've got 72 hours to penetrate and set as many appointments as you can as possible with these leads that I handed off. And we're seeing people start to pay on pipeline versus activity metrics. How many of the folks in the room manage their BDR functions versus having sales manage it? Your hand up if you manage BDRs. All right, so that's the other part of the issue, right? If you manage the BDRs, you can mandate how you want these folks to follow up on your leads. If you don't, you need to make a connection with sales so that they handle them appropriately. It's a really critical thing that our customers find is making a big difference. In terms of how TechTarget can help, well, by way of introduction, if you think of us as a media company or a demand generation company, if you're not familiar with us generally, we really think what our job is with respect to your efforts is to help you understand which companies are in market for the solutions that you sell. We're able to do that because we're the number one place on the web where people do their research. They find us first in Google when they're doing these very focused searches on the problems that they're trying to solve out there on the web. Because all of our content is categorized against 5,000 different topics, 10,000 if you include vendor and product names. We know exactly who's doing the research because they're our members. We know exactly what accounts are associated with, and we know exactly what they're looking at. So we can really help you to better understand the state of these accounts and whether or not they're really in market. We use that information to help drive your demand gen and marketing efforts because they're all based on our intent data. But also, like John pointed out earlier, we share that data directly with products like Priority Engine so that you can apply it directly to your efforts in things like marketing, automation, and scoring. So Priority Engine, what it can do for you, besides showing you which accounts we see in market, you can take any list you have, your leads, your existing accounts, your customers, and we'll stack rank it for which accounts are in market and show you who's showing the most activity. You can get advice from our client consulting teams, the folks who support your programs, on how to use these stack rankings to better score the accounts and augment your lead scores with account level scores for engagement. You can see which of your TechTarget leads are most active and who else is doing research at those accounts. You're able to pass along account level insights to sales. So that's a critical thing in terms of understanding that this lead is more important because it comes from an account that's active. We can embed a link with every single individual lead you pass on to sales that will link that BDR, SDR, or field salesperson to the views that John was showing you earlier that show you what's going on with the rest of the account, what content they're consuming, and who else at that account is doing research. So now that's giving your BDRs multiple entry points to better penetrate each lead that you pass along to. And as I mentioned, there's formats like Lookbook HQ out there that will help you to do this sort of binge self-nurture content consumption model, and TechTarget's media formats for our demand campaigns and our brand generation campaigns can do that for you as well. So that's marketing, automation, and scoring. So next up is ABM, and that's sort of the logical next step. We've already said that one of the things that makes nurture better and scoring better is applying ABM principles. So we find that the issue with ABM with a lot of our clients is this issue of balance, right? So I love this definition of ABM when you're trying to explain to people what it is, because I think it's great for getting your head around it, that ABM is like treating each account as a market of one. And so the idea there is you're going to marshal your marketing resources, your sales resources, maybe even the executive team of the company to help go after and win these accounts that are the top ones on your list. The problem is that's a really hard thing to scale. So if you're going to use ABM for more than a handful of your highest profile target accounts, you need to look for ways to scale. So that's something we'll talk about. ABM really changes KPIs for marketing, right? It's not about just generating as many leads as you possibly can. It's about penetration. It's about maximizing engagement at the account level. That is when you pass a lead along to sales, as Paul pointed out earlier. So ABM changes the KPIs for marketing in such a fashion that it's not just about delivering inroads, leads for the account. It's about insights as well. So making sure that when you hand off these leads to sales, they've got insights that allow them to pursue the kind of sales play that they hope to execute on the back end. And once again, the sales and marketing handoff can be a challenge as it relates to ABM. It was never really engineered for an account level handoff. It's all built around individual lead level handoffs. So, in terms of talking how customers address this, we'll do it in terms of some of the steps to building out an ABM strategy. So this isn't the model for ABM. There are lots of them, but it's a model, and it's one we see a lot of our customers employing. So, first step, define accounts. Who is it you want to go after? Second, identify contact at those accounts so you've got someone to go after and you can be productive. 3, build insights about those accounts, what they care about, what their profile looks like so that you can customize your messaging, create the messaging accordingly, drive interactions and engagement with those accounts, and execute sales plays. Set sales up to effectively penetrate. So, we'll talk about each of these steps and some smart things we see our marketers doing. So when it comes to defining accounts, I think the key thing here is this notion of efficacy versus effort, right? So consider whether your selection is really based on a propensity to spend with you or if it's just profile and aspiration. Have I built an ABM list that consists only of Global 2000 companies? Have I built an ABM list that consists only of those accounts in my salespeople's territory that they've been trying to penetrate for years and just can't, right? If you want to do that, that's great. Part of the idea here is to throw resources at that and convert them over the long game. But really the magic of ABM is identifying areas where you've got an opportunity to win with greater efficiency, right? So in that sense, priority often beats purity. In terms of selecting accounts, you don't necessarily want to go after the ideal. You want to set yourself up with accounts that give you a chance to win. The size of your list really needs to be in sync with your activation plans, right? So unless you're dealing with only a handful of accounts, if you're dealing with hundreds or thousands, then this isn't about individualing and customizing your outreach to every single account. That's too hard, just like nurture has become too hard to do even on a broader basis. It's all about finding commonality, traits, and similarities so that you can do messaging at scale that is nevertheless more appealing to these subsets of the accounts on your list. And then this last point is key, and it's largely the point of the presentation you just heard, but you want to go as far as you can to define the actual buying unit, right? So if you're defining your account-based marketing at the level of the companies you're going after, and you're targeting that way, and you're measuring your engagement that way, that leads to real problems with sales handoffs, right? Because if you're talking about a big pan-regional bank, for instance, that's got all offices all over this region, and you're noticing that, hey, you're getting that overall level of account to a degree of activity that makes it look like it's worthy of sales follow-up, you've got a problem when you try to go hand that lead off to sales, and it turns out that the activity you generated in Singapore has nothing to do with the opportunity for the rep in Sydney to follow up effectively, right? So ideally, you want to get it to the level of these buying units that Paul has talked about, the buying groups, but that's the ideal, but at a minimum, you at least want to regionalize, and that'll make for a better sales handoff. Okay, identify contacts. This is where we see people get tripped up early in their ABM efforts, because the ABM effort kind of goes like this. I've got my list, and now I want to go out and get as many names and as many leads as I possibly can for the accounts on my list. That's not what this stage is supposed to be about. This stage is supposed to be about identifying potential ideal entry points for sales, so the right personas at these accounts for you to go after, or signals of real engagement on the part of buyers there that would indicate that they're possibly in market. So what's productive is doing those sorts of things, finding engaged buyers, sourcing the right personas. What's potentially unproductive is simply maximizing the number of leads or the number of names that you've got for these accounts, because they're the accounts on your list and now they're the focus of your marketing efforts, because that can lead to two things. If you're going again and again after these accounts to generate as many names as you possibly can, now you're starting to spam them, right? And ABM is about creating a great customer experience with these accounts so that you can win them over in the long run. Sending them loads and loads of email, regardless of whether or not they're interested, or asking me to do it on your behalf, doesn't necessarily move the ball forward for you there. And from a sales perspective, if you're handing off lots and lots of leads from these accounts, you're back to a problem of false positives. You're feeding them names, you're feeding them people who you got to at least respond on an individual level, but it's not necessarily reflective of account level insight. Next step, build insights. So this can be sales work, and if you've got a small enough list, you can do it that way because they understand what the critical needs are and the interests are from their accounts, but it's really hard to do this work at scale. And if you're doing it at scale, it's all about trying to provide or identify this commonality between subsets of the accounts on your list. So talking in terms of data, predictive providers and compiled data providers can help here because they can help you identify traits of certain accounts that indicate that they're a good fit for your solutions. We really feel that intent data like what you see from Priority Engine can be a key factor here because that helps you to prioritize your effort against accounts that are actually showing purchase intent behavior at the moment. In any regard, from the perspective of building insights, it's all about finding out what these accounts care about, similarities in terms of what they look like, and what their interests are, because that allows you to play a game you know, as opposed to this super ultra customized account of one approach to ABM. You can, for instance, identify that they've got certain purchase criteria. They care about security factors. They are buying from a certain competitor of yours. You know how to deposition that person. They're in a certain industry. You know how to make an approach to that industry. These are the types of messaging that you've either already got on the shelf or you can much more readily develop in order to make sure that you penetrate and engage a significant number of these accounts, which is really the end game here. So from there, you move to creating messaging. And if you've done the right things in terms of identifying these common traits, you can verticalize your messaging or organize it around other really common themes. And if you do this correctly, you can deal with one of the common myths of ABM, which is it takes a fortune to build out the content in order to really hit the mark with these highly specialized campaigns for these individual accounts. Case studies, for instance, are half the battle. Right? If you can identify that the majority of your ABM accounts fit into these 5 different industries, you spend your time and effort building out 5 great case studies, you can use that as a centerpiece of your effort. You can adapt the front end of your messaging to refer to the insights you know in terms of what people in that industry care about, and you can use your case studies to front end other pieces of content. You could use them as the centerpiece of that microsite type experience. You can link to it. You can do call outs. So you can take your standard content, you can kind of wrap them up, front end them, and link to case studies, and develop this stream, a nurture stream for your ABM accounts that seems highly personalized, highly customized, but there's an ability to do it affordably and at scale. So a lot of what I'm talking about here is not super ultra purist ABM. It's a way to get it done practically. Because if you can deal with these accounts on an account level basis, your marketing will be more effective, and your scoring and what you hand off to sales will be more effective as well. Once you've identified those fundamental messaging streets, very important to mind your own lead data for content consumption patterns that surface more themes. So if you can find that there's a certain subcomponent of your content that they really care about, you can leverage that even more successfully to do more outreach to additional accounts. So drive interactions. And when we talked about that identify contacts thing, we see people getting this stage messed up very much with that stage. Here, again, you want to be very wary of traditional front-end lead generation KPIs. The most successful customers here focus on this notion of inroads and insights. You're looking to get the account to an overall level of engagement across the account that sales can leverage. So that's either interest across multiple stakeholders, maybe it's with the key stakeholders, maybe it's getting some people to really go deep and binge consume content who can potentially be your champions. And then it's deliver insights. Pay attention to what content they're leveraging, how they consume it, what they care about, because you need to pass those insights along to sales so that they can successfully engage. Next step, execute plays. The handoff to sales can really be a challenge. And if you think about it, it's not well supported, this account level handoff, by traditional MarTech and CRM. If you're a Salesforce user, you got things going on like leads don't really associate with accounts. They first have to be turned into opportunities, and contacts can be associated with accounts, but they're not leads, right? So it gets tricky to do this stuff. So there's stuff to figure out here. The key, again, is to make sure that somehow you pass along these account level insights. At a minimum, with us, you do it by embedding a link to what's going on with the accounts. But you can do things like enable the ABM modules in your marketing automation solutions. There's ABM-specific solutions out there, like Engagio, that will help you track how your engagement is going with marketing and how it's going with sales. That stuff costs money, so the alternative to that is making sure that you effectively manage the BDR or sales follow-up cadence and lead disposition methodology. So if you're handing off a lead that's a good lead because it's associated with a strong account signal of interest, you've got to make sure that they don't dial and ditch, that they don't just smile and dial and throw them in yesterday's lead pile because you've done all this work to deliver account level engagement. There are tools for this as well. A great one is SalesLoft, and what this will allow you to do, as opposed to handing off the leads to your BDRs and leaving them to their own devices with respect to sales follow-up, this will dictate or mandate the follow-up. So it will say, and it will pop it up in their inbox, hey, this account needs to get 5 emails this week. These are the emails you're going to send. They'll be pre-filled for them. These are the calls you need to make. And if you haven't done your 7th and 8th touch yet, the software is going to continue to ask them to do that. So this is a way, because passing along the account level insight itself could be hard, to make sure that sales follows up in an appropriate manner. Okay, revisiting this in terms of how Priority Engine can help your ABM strategy. Obviously, because we know which accounts are in market, we can do a lot to help you there. So this is sort of a view of the market where we see everybody who's in market, we see everybody who's on your ABM list, and we can match them up. So we can show you the accounts that are most active on your list with respect to the solutions that you sell. We can help you to prioritize those accounts, identify active purchasers and researchers at those accounts, so sales has got somebody to follow up with when they make their plays. Within the people that are in market but not on your list, we can identify lookalikes for you. So if we observe when you work with us and send us your list that you've got a lot of accounts on there that represent financial services industry of a certain company size or larger, we'll go out and find more accounts that look just like that for you that you hadn't bothered to put on your list. So we can help you to do that. And of course, we can help you target these people with content marketing to better engage them. Identify contacts. The key thing here is Priority Engine identifies not just which accounts are in market, but the actual individuals who are doing the research. And as John pointed out earlier today, now that we've partnered up with Discover.org, we'll provide you with the other personas on the team that are appropriate for you to go after when you're executing your sales plays. Build Insights, our data and reporting tools, will help you develop an account level view of all the activity going on there, as well as the engagement with you and your content. In terms of creating messaging, besides just giving you that account level view, we get we have back-end access to all the data that we give you on the front end. So we can go into your ABM list or subsets of your ABM list or groupings of accounts, and we can show you what they care about. Hey, these are the things that told them they wanted to make a purchase in the first place. These are the features that they're going to use to decide. These are the top vendors that they're considering for purchase. And for any subset of your ABM list that you want us to do that sort of content assessment and assessment of what the accounts care about, we can do that for you to help you better create your messaging. Driving interactions, we can promote to active researchers on your target account list. When you consider the other side of the Venn diagram, by the way, we can keep promoting to other active people who aren't on your list so that you can still drive lead gen while you kind of play the long game of ABM with respect to those accounts that might be harder to penetrate. And finally, when you execute plays, Priority Engine embeds account level insights right alongside of every lead so that when you pass the lead along, it always comes with the insight on what's going on at the account, what the account cares about, who else at the account is doing research, whether or not they're looking at your competitors. With our qualified sales opportunities, we take that same data, we actually confirm the purchase, and give you these nice 2-page and 3-page built-out sales plays that you can hand off directly to your account teams. Okay. So next up is intent data. And so when we were talking about scoring, we said an account level view can help. When we started to talk about ABM, we said intent and predictive data can help with that. So what are the challenges here? So this stuff can be hard. It's a lot of data to stitch together. You're pouring around in your own data. You're looking at external data. A key thing is to make sure that you come away with something that's not just informative, but actionable, right? It's nice to know that this is a stacked list of accounts. They're in market, but how do you action against that from a sales and marketing perspective? It's critical, since what we're talking about is using this stuff to help get rid of the false positives and false negatives in the first place, which you get out of your own scoring models, to make sure that you've got data that really does that. And then finally, you need to be able to integrate the data into your sales and marketing workflows so that you can action it. So, in terms of assessing this, let's take a little bit of a look at the different types of data are available and what they can do to help you with your efforts. So you start with the most basic type of data, which is compiled data that helps you to build a profile of the accounts. So this is what you know, or sort of what everybody knows about the account. So this is sort of firmographic stuff, industry stuff, company size, and this helps you establish that sort of initial target demand. It helps you to understand what's possible in terms of who it is out there that you can sell to. If you want to understand not just what's possible, but where you've got potential, that's when you start to look to predictive data. So hopefully, internally, you're looking at your reverse engineering from where you are most likely to get deals, where you win most of those deals. You identify the common attributes of those accounts, and you use that to help to begin to assess fit for your solutions, because your view is limited and focused on what you've got in your own systems. If you want to better understand other accounts out there in the market that it might not be apparent to you offer you potential, you start to look to external data. And this is when you learn from things like going-ons in the marketing, publicly available data, things like, hey, this company has just gone public, or they just did a merger, or they just hired 100 developers. And those are triggers that indicate that they might be in a state or a position where they're more likely to consider your solution. Beyond that is intent data. Internally, you've got your own intent data in terms of what you see, in terms of content consumption, interaction with your outbound promotions and your website that show that there's purchase interest that would allow you to better prioritize one of those accounts that has potential or a probability to spend. And because you can't see everything, external intent data goes out and scans the rest of the web for certain signals that you might not see because, for instance, they're researching with us, or maybe they're researching with your competitors, and that helps you to assess not only interest, but sort of the level of intensity of that interest, and allows you to prioritize one account versus another. Account level insights are key here. That's one of the things about predictive data and intent data. If you're using this stuff, you are doing account-based marketing, because these signals really only make sense at the account level. So some of the things we talked about earlier need to be put in place here as well. The fastest path to a return here comes from combining data sources. So if you combine predictive insights with intent, that can help you be productive by making sure you're going after somebody who's not just a fit, but actually has shown interest. By combining external data with internal data, that helps you to prioritize. That helps you to know who it's really important to go after first. And we'll come back to this notion in a second about not all intent data being created equal. So even as you layer these solutions on each other, this is still challenging. And that's because a lot of the data out there doesn't present the whole picture to you. If you're using predictive stuff, that's going to give you a sense of sort of what are the characteristics of account that could be in the market for your solution, and what accounts out there possess those characteristics. You may know when an account is in market, but you might not know how good a fit that account is. You might know when and what, but then there's a question of who it is that you potentially need to call. And as you look at the different account or intent and predictive providers in the market, you can see it really stratifies that way. It's kind of highly siloed. So the intent providers out there that most people are familiar with are really doing account level interest only. They're looking at the web for content that looks like it's related to what you sell, and they're associating it with accounts that look like they're doing that research. So they're going to tell you when, but you're not going to get the who or the what. The predictive players are all about those characteristics and what accounts show those characteristics, what those accounts care about. So that's somebody who's a good fit for you, but you don't necessarily know when to go after. And then there's providers out there, the Discover Orgs of the world, who are a great partner for us because they'll help you build out the entire account profile. They'll show you the org chart. They'll show you the key decision makers, but they're not necessarily going to give you that data about when they're in market or what they care about. So stitching these things together is important, or else finding a supplier who can help you by providing all that data can be critical as well. So this notion of not all intent data being created equal, when you look at intent, which is sort of like the highest order of this data in terms of really sussing out the real interest, it's important to understand how it's done. So what this account, or what this graph does, is it shows a scatter graph of Google search results for content related to what you sell. It would be for any particular topic. And on the upright axis is how that content ranks with Google, and the lower it is on that axis, the higher it ranks. And on the horizontal axis is how relevant that content is, how granular it is, how closely related it is to what you sell. So think about the difference between, if you're a data backup vendor, it's the difference between content that was consumed that related to storage, or maybe an article about EMC, versus something like cloud-based data backup, right? The fact that someone looked at EMC doesn't necessarily mean that they're in the market for your cloud-based data backup solution. And what you want to do is make sure that as much of your content that's being scanned by your intent provider is coming from the bottom left-hand corner of this graph as possible. Because that's the stuff that is ranking really high in Google, so you're dealing with your false negative problem there because it's capturing the lion's share of the research that's out there, and you're dealing with content that is directly relevant to what you sell and is also appearing on sites that are actually about making B2B technology purchases. So when you're dealing with intent vendors, you want to ask them where the data is coming from. Final point that we made is you need to be able to make use of this stuff. You want to be able to integrate it into your systems. So the first point we made early on is that this is account-based information. So you need to be able to pass along account-based insights. And to do that, you need to employ some of the things we talked about earlier on with respect to ABM and with respect to lead, nurture, and follow-up. So you either need to be able to get a view of the account and what's going on at the account over to your salespeople, or you need to be able to mandate the appropriate follow-up for an account which is actually in market. The other thing, and I think this is maybe the biggest thing to take away with intent-based or predictive solutions, is that accounts or leads or opportunities that are surfaced through this approach require campaign-based follow-up. What does that mean? Well, what it means is these people are on your radar as potential buyers because we've seen signals that indicate that's the case, but they don't necessarily know your brand, and they may not have yet consumed your content, right? Because we found on the internet that they were looking at what you sell. Or we developed a profile that indicated they're highly receptive to what you sell. So coming back to those objectives, whether it's for your marketing campaign, if you're following up with marketing, or whether it's for your BDRs, if you're following up through telesales, out of those identify, qualify, and engage objectives, it's all about engage at this point, right? Because if they fail to engage or you fail to engage, you took this account that showed signals of being in market and you didn't advance it. You didn't move it forward. So the key to doing that in taking a campaign-based approach is two things. It's context and it's content. In your marketing strategy or in your sales follow-up, you need to make sure that you reflect why it is that this account ended up on your list so that that can be reflected in your messaging. They're all about compliance or something like that, and you have reference their interest in compliance. And you need to have content. If it's marketing, you got to go with the best piece of content, the content that is going to maximally engage the greatest number of people, right? Don't think about late stage content. Think about your most engaging and often early stage content. So, hey, a lot of people think it's an engaged account. I'm going to send them late stage content. I'm going to use that to qualify them. Remember, these folks are at least already partially qualified. Your principal objective is to engage. If it's a salesperson, make sure that they're following up with whatever it is that's the best tool they've got to get a meeting, right? We've got this guide to compliance that we're going to bring with us on the meeting, and we're going to share it with you. Or we're going to do an on-site assessment, because their objective is to engage these accounts so that you can further advance your efforts with someone who's actually in market. In terms of how TechTarget can help, we are number one for Google search results about B2B content on the first page of Google, more than any of our competitors. And in fact, if you went out to buy the keywords that are associated, the AdWords associated with the keywords that we rank well for in terms of B2B technology content, it would cost $450 million a year in order to do that. So we are seeing the lion's share of pre-purchase research that happens out there on the web. So when it comes to this notion of when, what, and who, we are firmly in the bottom left-hand corner of that scatter graph I show you in terms of when, understanding what accounts are in market. Because Priority Engine identifies for you not just which accounts are in market, but who of those accounts are doing the research and what content they're most interested in. You've got the who and the what aspects covered. And because we can flow our data right into Salesforce.com or any of your marketing automation platforms, or pass it along with an embedded link to sales, we're very, very easy on that third part of the challenge of intent, which is making sure that the data is usable in your existing sales and marketing workflows. So again, Priority Engine will stack rank the accounts, give you the insights on the topics and vendors being researched, turnkey integration, and a really key thing is it can be a foundation for your efforts because it does sort of all of the steps for you. But if you're already using other solutions, it's a great way to supplement and augment what you're already doing, because you can take any other insights or lists that your other predictive providers or intent providers spit out, run them through our engine, and we'll tell you again which accounts rank the highest in terms of research they're doing with us, and who are the people we see at those accounts actually doing the research. So, kind of wrapping up, when it comes to these three areas, again, regardless of what you're doing in terms of your emphasis on any one three, there's some insights that can help you with all three. So I'd say the big ones are account level insights, making sure that you move toward scoring at the demand unit level as opposed to just the lead level. Looking beyond your own ecosystem for data that can help eliminate those false negatives and false positives and ensure a higher hit rate for your marketing and a higher hit rate for your sales follow-up. And again, I would say this concept of striving for more effective sales follow-up, adapting your disposition methodology to make sure that good leads get proper treatment. And remember this notion of following up with context and content. For any lead follow-up, whether it's your nurture stream or whether it's a BDR who's calling on the leads that you surface to them, having that content and having that context really helps them to be much, much more effective in their efforts in developing your content and in fueling your pipeline. So what I'd say for TechTarget's part in the end is when you're doing these sorts of things, we can be great fuel for your efforts because all of our solutions are intent-based. We use intent to target our demand, we use intent to target your brand campaigns, and we can feed our intent directly into your systems. But the other thing I would say, and it's a big thing I'm talking to customers about while I'm here in Singapore, is if you talk to us early about what you're trying to accomplish, we can really help with the strategy side of the equation, right? After all, we know who out there in the market needs your solutions, we know what they care about, we know when they want you to contact them, and we know how best to communicate with them because we're seeing all this data, all this back-end data, in our systems that we provide to you on the front end, and we're talking to you and all your peers and colleagues all the time about what they're doing and what works best, right? So we feel we can help so much more if you talk to us, for instance, when you're formulating your ABM list in the first place, than coming to us after the fact and just saying, hey, can you help us to execute these campaigns?